Not Chris, but we're glad you're here.
Good evening and welcome to the January 14th, 2021 meeting of the Conservation Commission. My name is Patrick Reynolds and we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Sue, would you do the roll call, please?
Patrick Reynolds.
Present.
Melissa Sharples.
Present.
David Bell.
Present.
Ellen Snyder.
Here.
Sarah Finch.
Here.
Sam Kenny.
Present.
Megan Brybeck.
Here.
And Melissa Brokel.
Here.
Did I say that right?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Chris.
Okay. Now, do we have any members of the public here for public comment? Nobody here for public comment? Okay. I'm going to proceed on. Tonight we have a guest speaker. Our guest speaker is Chris Nash. Chris is the manager of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services Shellfish program, which is a program within the department's Watershed Management Bureau. Chris has held this position for 21 years. Chris earned his Bachelor of Arts in Biology from BU and a Master of Science in Hydrology from UNH. Prior to working for New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, he worked in the New Hampshire Office of State Planning's Coastal Zone Management Program, focusing on topics such as non-point source pollution and state wetlands permitting. And he then served as the director of the New Hampshire Estuaries Project, now known as the Piscataqua Region Estuaries Partnership, or PREP. So, Chris, do you have the ability to share? You should be able to share your screen there at the bottom.
I hope so. Let's try
Okay.
it.
All right.
So thank you all for the invitation to come speak to you tonight. Let me see if is that working?
Yes.
Oh, great. Okay. So let me see if I can get the slideshow started and then.
Can everyone see that okay? Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Patrick, and thank you to all the commission members for the invitation to come speak to you tonight. What I am going to do is I spoke a little bit with Chris Blackstone to try to get an idea of what the members would like to hear about with regards to shellfish harvest in New Hampshire, keeping in mind that I have 20 minutes. Is that right? So I've got my little time clock going. So
Okay.
To that. Okay. I may have too many slides, but I'll try to get through them and stay within the time. So Chris asked for me to give you an overview of what are we talking about when we say shellfish. And then we'll talk a little bit about recreational harvest and commercial aquaculture in coastal New Hampshire. I'll describe some of the public health monitoring programs that I run and how those intersect with people's opportunities to harvest shellfish. And then if we have time, we can talk about a few emerging issues, specifically wastewater treatment facilities and harmful algal blooms. So what we're talking about here with shellfish, this is coastal New Hampshire, and there are bivalve or filter feeding shellfish. We're talking about clams, oysters, mussels. We're not talking about shellfish in the context of lobsters or crabs. Those are scavengers, but clams, oysters, and mussels are filter feeders. These are animals that burrow in the mud, or some of them live on top of the mud in estuary and coastal waters. They feed by siphoning the seawater through their bodies. They extend their siphons into the overlying waters, bringing in whatever is floating by, microscopic plants and algae, and that's what they feed on, which is great for water quality. It helps keep the water clear and sunlight to penetrate, so it's quite good for the ecology. However, not everything that's floating around is good. There are pathogenic bacteria, viruses. There are some algae forms, which I'll talk about, that produce marine biotoxins. And so these filter feeding shellfish can accumulate some of those harmful particles in their body And if you come by and eat them, you can get sick or even in extreme cases, die. So that's what, of course, we don't want to have happen. So it's the role of the DES Shellfish Program to examine all our tidal waters and figure out which ones are appropriate for harvest for human consumption and where we should not allow any harvest at all. So just a quick overview of what are people harvesting and what do these things look like. First, soft shell clams are recreational harvested. These are also known as steamers. You find them on tidal mudflats throughout coastal New Hampshire. Probably the best place to go is the Hampton Seabrook estuary. And so folks go out at low tide, look for the siphon holes in the mud, and then dig the clams out. We also have American oysters. This resource in coastal New Hampshire has fallen on pretty tough times. In the early to mid 1990s, there were two parasites that became prevalent in our waters, MSX and Dermo, and virtually all of our oysters are infected with these, and it really wiped out a lot of our natural reefs. We still do have recreational harvest for the remaining reefs. This is typically done by boat with what are called oyster tongs. That's those long-handled sort of garden rake-looking affairs that are hinged halfway between, and it allows the harvester to get down deep to reefs that are a little bit deeper. It's a good upper body workout for sure. They pull those up and dump the contents on their culling board and find the live oysters. Some people do harvest oysters by weighting, but this is probably one of the more common methods. There are other species that people pursue recreationally. Those would be surf clams, razor clams, and blue mussels, and occasionally mahogany quahogs, but those are really kind of the most important recreational species that we have in the state. We do have commercial harvesting. The Fish and Game Department does not allow the harvest of wild stocks of bivalve mollusks for commercial purposes, except for sea scallops. But oysters, clams, and mussels, if they are harvested commercially, they are grown by aquaculture operations. We do have some blue mussel farms. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the photos of those farms. I have them at the back end of this presentation if we have time, because it's kind of cool how they grow them. These are grown out in the open ocean, about 40 to 50 feet deep. That's kind of all I have to say about those. Oh, I didn't move the photos. You get them now. Okay, I'll talk quick. These, the way these are grown is these mussels are collected when they're babies. They are put in these sort of sock affairs with there's a rope that runs through the center of this. And then these socks or mussel ropes are suspended from an underwater, what is essentially a clothesline. So you can see them dangling here 40 feet deep. And they grow for about 2 years. And then the harvesting vessel comes by and picks up that underwater clothesline or that long line. And you can see down by this green buoy here, there's one of those dangling mussel ropes. And so here's another picture that a diver took. So you can see the collection of them along the long line. And they're brought on board. They're a little messy when they come out of the water. They've been in the water for 2 years, so they're covered in barnacles and byssal threads, and they need to be cleaned before they go to market. But that's how blue mussels are grown in the state. What's a more probably important commercial aquaculture operation is that of commercial oyster farming. Again, this is coastal New Hampshire. Most of the commercial oyster farms are here in Little Bay. There are 2 down in Hampton Seabrook Harbor, but I'll just blow up the Little Bay area so you can see where these farms are. There are 25 of these farms in Little Bay. They range in size from 1 acre to 4.5 acres. They have been around for a while. Oyster farming really sort of took off around 2012. We've been adding 2 to 3 farms a year since then. I think this is the first year that we didn't have 2 to 3. We only added 1, but COVID has taken a toll on that. Just a few pictures on how oyster farming is done. All the commercial oyster farms buy their oysters as seed from nurseries. They don't take any natural seed from the Great Bay Estuary. These come from 2 hatcheries up in Maine. Some farmers buy their seed very small, like that pepper flake size. And the farmers who do that then put that little tiny seed in a floating nursery, or what's called an upweller. So each of these blue barrels would have a load of seed in them. And then there's a water pumping system that basically force feeds the baby oysters by pumping seawater through those barrels. And over the course of a couple of months in the early summer, The farmers will continually take those seed out, sieve them, so they sort them by size, and then repack them in different barrels. And the goal is in the first couple of months to get these little tiny seed to about the size of your pinky fingernail, or 1/4 of an inch. And when they get to that size, then they're able to go out on the farm. Most farmers use this setup, which is known as an oyster condo. The tiny fingernail-sized seed go into these plastic mesh flat bags, and those bags are then inserted into what are called oyster condos, where they're stacked. And then those oyster condos are moved out to the farm, and these condos keep the seed separated so there's plenty of water flow and they can feed. So here's a picture of some of those oyster condos actually out on a farm. It's pretty rare to actually see these coming out of the water. Most of these almost all these operations are subtidal. And if you see the cages at all, you see them on the most extreme low tides. And that's what I was taking a picture of here. What you would know, or how you would recognize an oyster farm, is all of them have to be marked by yellow buoys with reflective tape. So if you see a collection of yellow buoys, you know you're in the vicinity of a farm. Once the fingernail-sized seed gets a little bit bigger, they're moved into what are called oyster trays, and that's really where they spend the rest of their 2 to 3 years of growth. They're handled multiple times between the time they're young and when they are large enough to be sold. When they are large enough to be sold, the farmer will pull the oyster tray, wash them down, cull them, looking for the really nice shaped, deep cupped ones that people like to have on their raw oyster plate in the restaurant. And then they're packed immediately in ice to keep them cold, which is a really important step in ensuring their quality and making sure that there are no public health issues that develop after they're taken out of the water. That's kind of recreational and commercial harvesting. Now I want to sort of switch gears and describe a little bit about how the DES Shellfish program, what we do, and how we try to ensure that everybody has shellfish that will be of the highest quality and not make anybody sick. So our job is to look at all of the coastal New Hampshire tidal waters, and following a set of guidelines that are uniform nationally, make determinations about where it's appropriate to allow shellfish harvesting, and where it's inappropriate because there is a risk of sewage contamination or a risk of actual contamination. What we're worried about mostly are bacteria and viruses that are sewage borne. We do have to worry about harmful algal blooms. There are other naturally occurring pathogens like Vibrio bacteria that have nothing to do with sewage, but can cause a serious gastrointestinal problem for people who eat raw shellfish. And we do have to keep our eye out for other poisonous and deleterious substances, PAHs, heavy metals, that sort of thing. That's generally not much of a problem, but we do some periodic checks of that as well. But most of our work revolves around the bacteria, viruses, and harmful algal blooms. So when we're looking at a particular area, the first step is to walk every inch of the shoreline. And we do a property by property survey, documenting the land use, looking for pipes, streams, failing septic systems, and anything that might be causing a pollution problem out in the receiving waters. And then we establish sampling stations, which are the red dots on this map. And then there's a couple of pictures of the types of things we see on the shoreline. These would then be sampled multiple times under different weather conditions so that we can determine which ones are really benign. A lot of these are foundation drains or culverts that typically don't carry anything, but some of them are problems, and then they get additional attention from us. While we're doing the shoreline walk looking for pollution sources, we are also out in the estuary. This is Great Bay. These are our ambient sampling stations. So these would be sampled initially many times under different tidal conditions, different seasons, different weather conditions, to start to get an idea of do we have chronic pollution problems or do we have intermittent pollution problems, perhaps relating to rainfall. What we're really focusing on is sampling seawater. Most of our stations are done by boat. We have something like 75 throughout coastal New Hampshire, and almost all of them are visited at least once a month. So water sampling for fecal coliform bacteria is the main thrust of that program, although we do occasionally have to pull shellfish samples and test those as well. Ultimately, what we're trying to get to is a map like this. This is a harvest classification map. After we put all those data points together, This is the map that sort of shows people where you can harvest and where you can't. So on this map, the green areas, which are classified as conditionally approved, would be areas that are okay for harvest as long as certain conditions are met. Like for example, in Great Bay, people can harvest as long as we haven't had 1.5 inches of rain or more, because once we get to that threshold, we start to see the impacts that violate the micro standards that we follow. Another common condition is that all the area wastewater treatment facilities need to be operating properly and keeping the waste treated within their discharge permit limits. And when they occasionally have problems, that's when we have to put a temporary closure on these sort of green areas. So because these green areas have conditions, we have to do a lot of communicating with the recreational harvesters as well as the commercial growers. On a weekly basis, we maintain a hotline, 1-800-43-CLAMS, that people can call to find out what is open for the coming weekend. A lot of harvest areas are only available to recreational harvesters on Saturday, so we update the hotline on Fridays. If we have something happening in the middle of the week, like a big sewage treatment plant problem or a hurricane or something like that, of course, we would update it midweek. A few years ago, we created what's called the New Hampshire Coastal Atlas, which is a sort of map or graphical interpretation of the clam flat hotline. So anybody can go into the Coastal Atlas, click on the harvest area map, and this is what you would see. The pink areas are areas that are open for harvest, and this map changes on a week-to-week basis depending on what's going on with weather or other issues. And if you, for example, wanted to harvest in Great Bay, you would look to see that it's pink, and if you clicked on that Great Bay, it would zoom you to that area and some additional information would pop up. So it's kind of an interactive tool that makes it a little easier to see what's open and what's not. If any of you do decide to go to that site, if you notice up here where it says map, you can click on that and you would switch from a map view to an aerial view, and then you could zoom in and you'd be able to recognize a little easier where you are. But I want to go back to the harvest classification map because there's this big red area and it's over by the Lamprey River, which maybe you're wondering about. And so I want to talk a little bit about that because the presence of a sewage treatment plant, actually this red area has to do with the presence of 3 sewage treatment plants, Newmarket, Newfields, and Exeter. And it's not there because these plants do a poor job at treating their waste. Actually, all of them do a great job at treating their waste. But we have to recognize that a sewage treatment plant is a mechanical system, and it's run by people, and mechanical things occasionally break and people sometimes make mistakes. And all of our wastewater plants from time to time have problems where they release insufficiently treated sewage into the water. And these 2 slides are really meant to sort of visually show you how this can be a problem very quickly, especially in coastal New Hampshire where we have such fast tidal currents. What these graphs are meant to show is on this over here, this would be the location of a wastewater plant that's just beginning to, say, lose its disinfection capability and putting a lot of high bacteria effluent into the water. In very short time, if that goes on for more than an hour or 2, that high bacteria water is going to be carried by our fast tidal currents very quickly, very far. And so we have to recognize this, and part of the regulations that we follow require that we put permanently closed safety zones around every outfall where there's never any harvesting to sort of protect against anybody harvesting within an area that's so close to an outfall that we wouldn't know quick enough to tell them don't harvest here. There's an accident going on today. And I'm going to graphically show, well, here, I'll just show you how a few slides about how we delineate those safety zones. And then I want to show you some data from the Newmarket wastewater plant. To size those safety zones, to get data on how quickly this insufficiently treated effluent can move through the estuary, where it goes, how much it's diluted. We inject a red dye called rhodamine WT into the wastewater stream. These are actually pictures from a Durham wastewater study we did. This is the vat of dye. This is the injection pump, and this is the feed line. So we'd be dripping dye into the treated effluent, which would then go out through their outfall, and in this case, into the Oyster River and run downstream on the ebbing tide. And then we are out in boats with fluorometers and GPS units. We have instruments moored at different locations in the estuary. That while this is going on, we can see where the dye is and how quickly it got there and what its dilution levels were like. We did one of these studies at the Newmarket wastewater plant in April 2004, and I just thought maybe you'd be interested to see, some of the findings from that, study. So what I'm going to show you is a time series of dye concentrations. We, in this case, came up at slack high tide and started the injection at about 7:30. And then the idea was to do a worst case look at how quickly stuff would get into Great Bay. So what you're looking at here is the position of the plume just 1.5 to 2.5 hours after we started the injection. And so I think this sort of illustrates how quickly things move in our estuary. For a problem that happens at the Newmarket wastewater facility, it is in Great Bay within 3 hours. And we still have 3-4 hours of ebbing tide. And so over these next slides, these will be an hour by hour look so you can see the progression of the plume. I do want to call your attention to this area down here. This was a big mudflat, and this is an area that had the potential for recreational harvest. So part of this study involved the establishment of grab samples to make sure we knew whether or not dye was getting over here. Because if any of you are familiar with Great Bay, it's quite big, but it's also quite shallow, and a lot of these areas are exposed at low tide. And the hope was this would become channelized before it reached those areas. So here's the next hour. So this is 2.5 to 3.5 hours after the injection. And these are just an hour by hour look, so you can kind of see how things are progressing. Darker reds are meant to indicate higher concentrations of dye. By the time we got to the end of the ebb tide, this is sort of what the picture looked like. Let me just back up one. It was at this point where we really were not seeing, we weren't getting any data off these points anymore because there was no water over here. So by this time, things had really been channelized. And, this is sort of what the picture looked like. So this is the type of data that we would use to eventually draw the boundaries of this large red area. And this area that's green is called conditionally approved because if we had a problem at Newmarket or Exeter, these areas would certainly be impacted eventually. They just wouldn't be impacted on the first ebb tide. So there would be time for us to recognize it and to let people know, okay, you can't go to the green areas this weekend because we had a problem in Newmarket. Trying to determine when it's safe to reopen. How am I doing on time?
We're doing fine. Let's keep going.
Great. So I'll try to run through, we'll just do a little harmful algal bloom discussion because this is becoming more and more of an issue for us. There are a lot of different types of microscopic algae that live in the ocean and in the estuaries, and most of them are not harmful at all, but some of them do produce potent neurotoxins, and we need to watch out for those. The one that's most common in New Hampshire and that happens almost every year is paralytic shellfish poisoning. We are in a time where we are developing a problem with amnesic shellfish poisoning. In fact, this was the worst year for the species that we're looking for. We didn't have any toxicity, but we've never seen numbers of pseudonychia, which is the species, and I'll show you pictures of it in a minute. We've never seen numbers like what we saw this year. We also look for diuretic shellfish poisoning. PSP is potentially fatal syndrome, so we have to take that very seriously. Amnesic, it causes flaccid paralysis, the biotoxin. So with symptoms, you sort of feel giddy, dizzy. If you are exposed to very high levels of the toxin, it causes flaccid paralysis, which in the most severe cases paralyzes your diaphragm and the victim asphyxiates. And without supportive therapy, they would die. Amnesic shellfish poisoning, that causes permanent short-term memory loss, and in severe cases, it can be fatal as well. So we have to take these seriously. And I just want to run you through a little bit about what we do to keep our eye on these issues. Our monitoring program involves weekly sampling of phytoplankton at 4 stations that are shown here. We have added a 5th permanent station in Little Bay. Actually this year, I'll show you in a second where that is. It's right in the middle of all the farms actually. So you've kind of already seen where we do that. We come out pretty much all year, every week, and check for the way the sampling happens is we collect 10 liters of seawater over here. We then run that 10 liters through these little filtering mechanisms to get 10 liters down to 15 milliliters. So what we're doing is concentrating the sample so that we have a better time working under the microscope at getting a good identification and a good count. And that's what's happening on the bottom slide, as our analyst is actually looking at that concentrated sample and counting different harmful algal blooms in these little microscope cells. So this microscope slide has a number of cells in them. This is one cell. Each sample is counted, is analyzed by counting 200 of these. And they are counting 10 different species in each of them. This is pretty tedious work. This is a very busy slide, but if you notice a lot of the needle-like looking organisms, those are the pseudonychia that causes amnesiac shellfish poisoning. And it's a very difficult thing to manage because we can't, under the light microscope, identify the species. There are about 25 species described for this area of the Gulf of Maine. Most do not produce toxin, some do, but they don't always produce toxin. They have to be under a certain set of conditions that gets them angry. So, and we never know if we could be seeing 1 million cells per liter, a crazy number. And if they're all happy, they're not producing any domoic acid, which is the toxin of concern. So this is a really difficult one to manage. And this year we saw more pseudonychia in our waters than we ever have. But just to jump back to paralytic shellfish poisoning, because this is what we see the most, caused by the genus Alexandrium, which you see in the upper left. We not only do the phytoplankton monitoring at those sites, but for this one, we just do straight mussel tissue sampling every week at 2 locations throughout the season, which for this would be April through October. Just an idea of the seasonality of this, you're looking at Alexandrium cell counts from 2 locations for the bloom period of 2019, which was a very bad year for PSP. If you'll focus on the yellow dots, those are Hampton Seabrook near the open ocean, which is typically where these blooms begin. And we usually see PSP beginning in late April, early May, and that is what happened in 2019. And then the cell counts rose steadily, the mussel toxicity was going with it, and we had a peak right about mid to late June. And then eventually it petered out. The Emery's Bridge site, the dark reds, are from the location of where the oyster farms are. So we don't normally see PSP there, but we did in this year, and we did see toxicity up in that area. It was just shy of the threshold to cause a closure. And we were sampling every other day in those oyster farms to make sure we were on top of it. Just to give you sort of a picture of how this has evolved over the last 20 years or so, we really had no toxicity for PSP in 2000. 2005 marked a very important time throughout the Gulf of Maine. We had an extremely severe and widespread event throughout the Gulf of Maine. That was one of our worst years. What you're looking at here, when we measure blue mussels for toxicity, we are looking to see if they have a toxin level of 80 micrograms of saxitoxin per 100 grams of tissue. That's the closure threshold. So what you're looking at here are the number of samples in that year that exceeded that threshold. So 2005, we had 9 samples of all those weekly samples that were over that closure threshold. So our last bad year was 2019, and in 2020, that's not on the graph, but we saw no Alexandrium activity at all. So this does seem to be cyclical, and it may have something to do with larger ocean scale circulation patterns in the North Atlantic Oscillation. There's a lot that goes on to sort of bring these blooms to bear. That's just a little bit of it. So I think I've probably gone over my time. And so this is where I was planning on stopping. I'd be glad to take some questions, or if anybody has any.
Chris, a number of years ago, UNH had a project to reestablish oyster beds at the mouth of the Lamprey River. Are you familiar with that project?
Yes.
What does that look? Is that making any progress? Are those oysters growing out there? I know they're not harvestable, but I mean, are they thriving at all out there, or?
So that project was sort of became a partnership between UNH and now the Nature Conservancy. And the Nature Conservancy has really taken the lead on advancing oyster reef restoration. And that was one of the sites. It seems that each year they create new sites, and some of them do well and some of them don't. One of the challenges with these restoration projects is not just getting the funding to do the restoration, but then getting the funding to do the monitoring. I do know that there are some funds available now for monitoring. One of the things that the Nature Conservancy did as part of COVID was the oyster farmers were facing a pretty serious problem because they have to move their product. The oysters, the baby oysters they put out last year are growing right now, and they need to move them to make room for the next ones, although the restaurants shut down. And so a lot of their markets disappeared, and they were facing a problem with what are we going to do with these oysters? I mean, they had a problem that they needed to make a living, but they also needed to make room to move the other oysters. So the Nature Conservancy, last year, I spoke with them about possibly buying what we call the farmers' uglies. When the oyster farmers plant all those seed, first off, you should realize that in the first year, they lose roughly 60% of them to mortality. In the year after, it can be anywhere from 20 to 40%. Not all of them look beautiful and pretty. I mean, the oyster farmers, it's a pretty intensive process to work with those oysters to try to encourage that deep cup and that round shape, but ultimately some of them don't look very good. We call those uglies, and they can't sell them. So I buy them for testing, and the Nature Conservancy said to the farmers this year, we will buy all your uglies and anything else you want to sell us. And we're going to use all of those adult oysters and put them out on restoration sites that already have restoration permits. Didn't have to do any new permitting, but so they sort of help their growers, but they also really infused a lot of these restoration sites with adult thriving oysters that will probably, we would hope to do very well. There is monitoring associated with that. I mean, we haven't seen what that is yet, though. They're compiling that now.
Thanks.
If you do a search of the Today Show, they did a nice story of that partnership. You can probably find that story still online.
Chris, I have a question. When
Yes.
people refer to the red tide, they are then talking about the paralytic shellfish poisoning mostly?
Yes. So the term red tide, because it gets people's attention, but it really is kind of a misnomer. When we get these blooms, they sometimes can tint the water red, but usually they don't. And they really don't have anything to do with the tide, but that's usually what they're talking about, is the paralytic shellfish poisoning. And if you hear about a red tide in Florida, you'll hear that term down there. That's a completely different species than what is causing our red tide up here. Theirs has a very fragile outer coating on the shell, and it can cause problem for swimmers. We don't have that issue here. Our algae are tougher. We have a tougher shell. Just how they grew. Any others, or I can probably stop sharing, I guess, huh?
Well, thank you, Chris. We appreciate all the information. It was really interesting to learn, and hopefully those graphs will be going in the right direction in the coming years. We'd all like to see the bay get better. So,
Well, thanks very much for having me, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
okay, thanks, Chris. Okay, so did everyone get a chance to review the minutes from December 10th, 2020?
Yes.
Any edits or questions?
Motion to approve as written?
Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
You
Thank you,
see,
Sam. Go ahead and call the roll.
sure. Oops, back page 2. Patrick Reynolds,
Yes?
Melissa Sharples,
Yes.
David Bell,
Yes.
Ellen Snyder,
Yes.
Sarah Finch,
Yes.
Sam Kenny.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Ellen, do you have a treasurer's report for us?
I do, and I think I forwarded the documents today. So in the general fund, the balance is $1,422.23. The one expense we had last month was SELT monitoring of the Hilton easement, which was $191.04. So that was the conservation, that was the general fund. Okay, for the conservation fund, the balance is $245,945.07. The income since last time was $98.71. We have a couple outstanding expenses, as you know, from last month. The $75,000 for the Clark easement has not come out yet. And we have $2,500 budgeted for the Heron Point Management Plan, which will come later whenever they get that done. Patrick, do you want to talk about the $4,000? Because that didn't show up in any of the accounts yet, but.
Okay. So we were contacted by the Newmarket Masonic Lodge. I believe I'm referring to that correctly, or they're the Freemasons, and they actually were closing they're closing their operation. And they did have some funds that they usually donate to organizations, and they wanted to donate those funds in their account to Shanda Park. And the reason they did that was because their chapter, I believe their lodge, is actually named after Mr. Shanda, who the park is named after as well. So they wanted to do it in his honor. So those funds, $4,000 approximately, I think there might be 4,000 and change, will go into the Shanda Park Fund, which does have a separate line item. And those funds could be used for maintenance towards the park or something along those lines. So that was very generous of them to do, and we're sorry to hear their organization's not going forward, but we do appreciate them making that contribution to Shanda Park.
Yeah, it's great. So the current balance of that line item is $764.46. So 4,000 will add a lot to that line item.
Was that $764.60?
46 cents.
46 cents. 764.46.
Yep.
Thank you.
That's it for treasurer's report.
Thank you. Okay, town council. Megan.
Hi all. Had to unmute. Hopefully you all saw that the meeting in December was successful as far as the easement goes, so that's very exciting. I apologize, Patrick, that my internet cut out at the moment of my vote. I hope that my voice came through. I had a minor panic, thanks to family, but messing with the Wi-Fi during important moments. So that was very exciting. There aren't a ton of updates, given that we've only met once since then because of the holidays. But just to make sure everyone knows about the changes coming with doing the deliberative sessions virtually. So we're having the 2 town meetings as opposed to the normal in-person deliberative session leading up to the election on March 9th. And the dates and links for all of that will be on the town website.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, planning board?
We have not had a planning board meeting since our last conservation commission meeting. Our planning board meeting is scheduled for the 26th this month.
Looks like you're freezing a little bit, but I think we got that. You'll have a meeting later this month.
Yeah, the 26th.
Okay. All right. So the next thing I have on to talk about is just a few notes from various things that came in. We did have the 2 easements that are monitored by SELT, Southeast Land Trust, does the monitoring for 2 easements. One is on the Hilton property and the other is on the Dodds property. And they always send us copies of those, and there's no easement violations to report or concerns on those 2 properties. But we do pay for those every year. So I wanted to make sure and report back on that, and that we got all of our easement reporting done. So we're complete for 2020. So good work by everybody this year in getting that done timely and on time. So good news there. We talked a little bit already about the Shanda Park donation. I think one thing that I might push back, and I haven't really heard much from this group, but Megan, there was a Riverfront advisory group created, I thought, at one point by the town council. And it was sort of looking at the whole riverfront comprehensively, but I think obviously a big part of that is Shanda Park. So I'd be interested to know if they've had any additional thoughts or ideas about how they might or things they're interested in addressing in that group. Have you heard anything? Any reports from that?
No, I'm actually not sure that that group's even met I joined the council in July, and I don't think they've met in that half year. So I'd be happy to bring it up at town council next week and just see if anyone has any updates or about how we might get a meeting going there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we do have to consider, and it is nice that we have some funds for Shanda Park to think about, is we might go back to the engineering group to pay for some sort of study to look at the area right at the waterfront where the park is, where we have a lot of erosion occurring. And we really need to sort of make a judgment about what can be done there to, one, make it safe for people, and 2, what's the best long-term solution, since one of the issues is the causation of it is not going away. In other words, sea rise, more events of intense rainfall occurring more frequently. So all those things are still present there. So one of the concerns is obviously making a big investment in something that might not be able to withstand those future issues. So that's why I think it's important for the town to consider. It's also probably one of the most used public spaces in downtown Newmarket. So it's we've heard a lot. We had a group come and speak to us last year about the sort of value that your local waterfront can bring to your community. If you have an attractive waterfront where people can walk and play and just relax, it can really be a huge stimulant for your economy downtown. So, I mean, I think it's a larger issue for the town to think about too, for that reason, from an investment point of view. So,
Patrick?
yep.
So the town of Durham had applied for a big grant as part of their Living Shoreline project at Wagon Hill Farm. And they did get that grant. And that is like there's some planning aspect to it. I'm actually somewhat involved, and we have a meeting next Friday. So I can look into it a little bit to see if there's any way that Newmarket can somehow tap into that whole big project and maybe get some planning assistance or something in terms of related to that
we-
shoreline. So,
Yeah, we did have that group come down to visit our shoreline. But at that point, there wasn't anything for us to apply for at that point, because I think that round of applications had already passed. So I think that was one of the things that we needed to find out about was, yeah, when would be the next opportunity for us to apply for that?
mhm. I
Um,
can find out and bring it back to the next meeting to see if there's some collaborative effort.
yeah. I mean, we also, the other challenge we had, I remember, was we only have a very small area right now that sort of looks sort of similar to Wagon Hill, you know, in terms of, we've got a lot of our waterfront is riprap or stone, right? And doesn't a living waterfront have to have more a grassy area? Or maybe I'm misunderstanding
Yeah,
that.
but I'm not sure if it has to be living shoreline. I mean, I think the idea is restoring the shore so it's more sustainable. So we'll find out. I'll
Okay,
see what
all right,
that.
that's great. That's good. All right. So those are the things under that's all the information I have under things that I've received recently. Under old and new business, I just wanted to, as Megan already brought up, the Clark Farm easement, the final step was just the town accepting the executory interest in that easement. So again, what that means is if Southeast Land Trust as an entity was to dissolve and no longer exist, the town of Newmarket would then be responsible for the easement and be on the deed as the easement monitoring entity. As it is, CELT will be that entity, which is great because they're a great organization and they do all the work and we get all the benefits of having this easement in our town. So it's a great deal, and I look forward to completing that final step when we just have to pay the money at this point. I'm assuming they'll ask us for that check sometime in the next few months here. And again, we finished all our easement monitoring. I talked a little bit about ideas for the coming year now that we're in 2021. So obviously right now what we know is that we probably, at least into June, it's not unlikely to estimate that we'll still be sort of in a very similar situation in terms of the virus. And so that might limit, you know, any sort of larger group activities that we could sponsor or anything like that we might want to do. But some ideas that I did have could be things that we could encourage people to do, and then record them on social media on our webpage, either on the Instagram page or the Facebook page. So for April, what I was wanting to do was do a town cleanup, because I know whenever I walk down a road or in an area, I always try and bring a little bag, but we could definitely use a good cleanup, and I'm sure by April, it'll be even a little bit worse. And what we would do is just encourage people to, sign up. Maybe we could have a central sign up, like in the past when we've done townwide cleanups, people just pick streets that they went on, and then they went and had a bag and cleaned it up and then tied it off and left it on the side of the road. And then Public Works came by and gathered up the trash. So I'd love to sponsor something like that in April as part of Earth Day celebrations, just to get people out and about, and also just get all the trash picked up that we see all the time. And again, I thought that would be something that people could do with their families. You don't have to be in a large group to do that. And so what do you guys think of that idea?
Love it.
So let's think about maybe steps that we might need to do. I think it would be a good idea to ask people to sign up for streets. And so maybe as we get closer, like say March, we put out an announcement that we're going to be doing a cleanup in April, and then encourage people to sign up by saying what street they're going to clean. So we can try and hit as many parts of town as possible. So that was my idea for April. And then my idea for June was, again, I totally stole this from another group, but what they were doing was going around their town and looking for either sort of rare examples of trees or champion sized trees. So Ellen probably knows a lot about this, but there's actually like a listing of championship size trees, and that just means they're really big, really old trees in New Hampshire. And there's lists across counties and across the state. And so the idea would people would go out and look for those trees. So an example would be like at Heron Point, we have a butternut tree, which is actually becoming a really rare species of tree in New Hampshire because of some diseases that are affecting them. Or we have an American elm tree that's actually right downtown that was a survivor of Dutch elm disease. So that's kind of cool that we at least have one elm tree down there. And another example is actually over by the high school, there is a really big blue spruce tree it's right in somebody's front yard, like right next to the high school. That's actually, I think, the largest, or it has been listed as the largest blue spruce tree in Rockingham County. So that would be the idea, is that people could just go out and photograph the trees and then put them up on our Facebook page. And the connection is that June has Arbor Day, right? So that's sort of the tie-in. So those are some ideas I had. Again, I'd love to be able to do something where we sponsored a group learning activity or something, a walk or something like that, but I'm not sure that we're at that stage right now that we could plan something like that.
Could we have as a guest someone from either Thompson School or Cooperative Extension come to do something at our April meeting to help us better identify the trees? And I've been looking online for tree ID information for a while. I think my father had a text or something, but I would really like to know what we could be looking for and ways to identify them. And if we, yeah, Ellen.
Well, we might want to invite Kevin Martin, who's in Epping. He's the one who wrote the book on the Big Tree Program. He's great. I'm sure he would love to do it. He's right nearby. I mean, you do Zoom anyway, but yeah, we could get Kevin.
That would be.
Yeah, no, Kevin's perfect for that. Yep.
Yeah. Do we have people scheduled yet for that far out at our meetings with Chris, or?
I don't know, but I'll check with her about inviting Chris or Kevin.
Okay. I have access to a couple copies of that book, so I can look up Newmarket and maybe scan some pages and email them to people. I'm only familiar with a couple of the trees, and it's sad that I don't really know any of the ones that are Newmarket, but I can definitely look in the book and get some more info too.
That's great. Good idea.
Yeah, that book that's a very good resource for identifying the trees too, because it can be trickier with certain species. All right. So that concludes everything that we had for our public meeting tonight.
Patrick, I had one more. We had talked about pursuing doing some of the management at Wigan Farm in 2020.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So we can apply to Fish and Game. They have a small grants program. So if you want, I can look into that and see if we can't put something together. And apply.
Yes, I would really like to get those areas cleared out, whether it's through a grant from them or whatever it takes, because I do think the areas that you identified in your management report like 4 or 5 years ago now, those areas do need to be cleared out, I think.
Exactly the kind of project they like to fund in that small grants program. So
okay, great.
look into that.
Oh, that reminds me, speaking of grants, so I did also attend the funding opportunities for the restoration enhancement projects for stream crossings. So they have a huge amount of money for that project, for those projects this year. It's, I believe, around $2.5 million that they have for improving stream flow and or crossings, culverts in particular. So I had some thoughts about that as well. And I did attend. I do see how to apply for that. I do think we have 2 places on the Piscasset River that would be good candidates for those projects. One would be the culverts at Ash Swamp Road, which impedes any kind of passage between anywhere upstream of that. And the other place would be right at Grant Road. There's a tiny but very old stone dam that if that was removed, you would also have, you would basically restore the stream from Piscasset Ice Pond in Newfields all the way to where the water goes over the little waterfall there on Packers Falls Road. And you pretty much have a free-flowing river all the way between those 2 spots. So that was, and the other area would be on Ash Swamp Road, where we have this small stream that goes from really a large wetlands complex that's on the south side of Ash Swamp Road, or west side, I guess, maybe it is there. And we had all the issues with the turtles. So that would be the other area to look at. But those were the 2. But if anyone else can think of another culvert or stream crossing project, let me know, because I need to start working on that if we're going to apply for it. And I'd like to also take whatever we get to LRAC to see if they would support it, because they said in the presentation, the more people you can get supporting your project, the better chance you have of getting funding. And I think Fish and Game would probably support it too, because of the fish population part of it.
This would involve permitting. Did they talk about needing to get permits to remove anything from a stream like that? Like a stone?
Yeah, they are, but if it's improving, what they want to do is restore stream flow to a normal state, right? So that it's better for flood conditions, it's better for everything that lives in the stream. So neither of these projects I can see running into any concerns in terms of that they would leave things in a better environmental state. Just culverts, especially you're probably talking about an entire bridge replacement, we know run close to $250,000, if not a little bit more, based on what Loberman Creek costs. But again, they encouraged people to apply for these. So they weren't saying don't apply if it's larger. They actually were encouraging you to apply if it was a little bit bigger because it would have a bigger impact. So, so we'll see. I can't hurt to apply. Okay. So is there anything else now? All right. So I'm going to just let Tim know. So let me go ahead and read. So I'd like to make a motion to go into a non-public session to discuss confidential matters related to real estate pursuant to RSA 91-A:3, Part 2, Section C.
Second.
All in favor? Patrick, aye.
Melissa, I.
Ellen, I.
David, aye.
Aye.
Sam. Sarah?
Aye.
Okay. And Melissa.
Okay.
Melissa. Okay. All right, so did anybody second that?